Now, the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, Chika Mordi, says there is a dangerous divergence in the economic recovery seen in developed economies from the developing and low-income countries around the world. That much was revealed in the Regional Economic Outlook report for sub-Saharan Africa, which was released about a week ago. The report was entitled One Planet, Two Worlds, Three Stories. But what new thinking or ideas exist out there that Africa can tap to bridge the dangerous divergence of the emerging global economy? My guest on this tonight is an investment banking professional, an adjunct professor of the Johns Hopkins University and the chairman of United Capital. Professor Chika Mordi joins us live from Washington, D.C. Great to have you on the show tonight, Professor. Good evening to you from Lagos. Thank you very much for coming through.
Good evening, boss, and thank you for having me on your program.
It's good to have you. Thank you so much. Give me the general view of the world of business today for emerging and frontier markets, looking at where we're coming from with the 2020 global pandemic.
Okay, first of all, it's difficult to have an aggregate view because, like you rightly alluded to that report, there's a divergence not just between the developed economies or what is now looking like a three-tier sort of global economy, but within those tiers, there are significant divergences. So what you've seen in the first three, we ended Q3 this year, and if you compare it to last year, you'd see that if you aggregate Europe, Middle East, and Africa, you had a 4.2% growth, which is better than expected. If you disaggregate that, there's even stronger growth in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. However, Asia itself had a relative decline, as did many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, there are two big drivers of what is going on now and in the near future. Obviously, the COVID pandemic was a big driver of that and the responses to it. So the kind of economic simulation you saw in certain economies wasn't across board because some simply didn't have the money. And the nature of the lockdown itself differed from country to country. Now, a lot of that money is no longer going to be injected in 2022. It's restored demand quite all right, and there's been some recovery. But because of those injections, you saw higher returns in equities in the US market, and inflation has crept in as well. This has had ramifications for the expectations for yield and returns in emerging markets. And sub-Saharan Africa is pretty much different in terms of a frontier market, depending on the specific countries.
But the point is this: are there new thinking, new learning curve out there right now in the developed economies that the private sector, businesses in Africa can leverage in the post-pandemic period as we look at what the chief economist at the IMF called dangerous divergence? Those were very serious phrase to use coming from the IMF, dangerous divergence.
Mm-hmm. And it's dangerous. It should be very disturbing. I'll give you one statistic before I answer your question. If you look at, say, Belgium and Nigeria, and you backtrack 4 or 5 years, you'd see that the GDP of Belgium was something like a quarter less than that of Nigeria's, over 400 billion. Ours was a bit over $500 billion. Today, the population of Nigeria has grown beyond the entire population of Belgium in that 4-year period. Yet the GDP of Belgium has massively outpaced that of Nigeria. Now, to answer your question, there are very strong learning points. The pandemic brought in some three crises. There was the obvious health crisis, there's an economic crisis, and then there's a crisis with delivery, both in terms of physical goods and services that governments deliver. Now, companies learned from that. They've retooled how they deliver. They become more efficient because the idea of physically being in a location for work has been redefined in many industries. There are learning points from that. There are learning points from how the logistics of delivery has been rethought and has been redone. And in terms of the health crisis, the vulnerabilities we saw for pandemic within the region, businesses also have got learning points in terms of redundancy and how to address those vulnerabilities with disaster recovery.
But again, when you look at institutions of learning, you talk about Harvard, you talk about Johns Hopkins University, you talk about others. Are we coming up with new thinking? Are there new thinking out there or ideas that could work for emerging and frontier economies such as Africa, not just tailored to developed economies that are already way ahead?
Well, very often, as is the case with when there's new technology, it's much easier for frontier economies like ours because in a very paradoxical way, the paucity of infrastructure means that you can leapfrog. Think about telecommunications and how it changed here, and think about digital jobs, right? So there's learning in that sense, but not just learning from what they did, but seeing opportunities because we have the flexibility, strategic flexibility to do much more than they did. And the example I gave, for example, I chaired the board of United Capital, and during the COVID, the pandemic and the shutdown and everything else, we worked remotely. And even as we've returned to the office, there's far more efficiency, either per square feet or per person, as a result of a response to that. And that is a clear learning point. And in terms of deliveries, people are now using platforms, digital platforms in particular, to disintermediate this idea of going to a physical location if you have to get a service, whether it's healthcare, whether it's a physical good or some sort of service.
Do we have any competitive advantage in sub-Saharan Africa in view of the emerging new world, global economy, the pandemic, and the geopolitics?
Absolutely. One of them is what I did mention earlier on, that there is greater strategic flexibility because you don't have sunk costs in infrastructure. So as we begin to rethink issues like energy, especially in the context of climate change, and I hope we get to talk about that and what we're all doing to go towards net zero. There's far greater flexibility, so it's cheaper because you can leapfrog existing infrastructure to get to the most cutting-edge infrastructure that are cheaper, more efficient, cleaner. There's obviously the demographic advantage that Africa enjoys, especially sub-Saharan Africa. We are by far the youngest continent. We're the continent that has the fastest growing population, and we are also a continent that has, because you have this mixture of youth and growth, there's a potential for not just an internal market within Africa, but obviously the external market as well. And side by side with that is lower labor costs, right? And again, the infrastructure advantage. So if you have lower labor costs, you have a young growing market, then it's a very great place to manufacture, clean manufacturing, hopefully. And then obviously Africa still has a resource advantage. The rare minerals, rare earth, like things like coltan that we have in cell phones and the rest of it still comes from Africa, as are the more obvious natural resources.
Okay, now you're talking about resources. That takes us to an important conversation you talked about earlier on the COP26, the UN Climate Change Summit starting this Friday. Stand by, Professor Mordi, and stand by, everyone. We'll take this conversation some notches higher when we return. This is Arise Exchange. Yeah, welcome back to Arise Exchange, and my interview with Chika Mordi on new thinking on economic recovery for emerging and frontier markets continues. Chika Mordi, thank you very much for standing by there in Washington. You talk about the COP26, we'll get to that, but let's talk about specifically to Nigeria's economic direction. What are your views right now, where we are and where we should be?
Quite frankly, I'm concerned and troubled, and I think every well-meaning Nigerian or Nigerian observer should be. The economy is facing very dire challenges. It's obvious. There is a debt crisis. There is intense fiscal constriction, and this is all happening in the context of some precarity, in terms of insurgencies and violent security issues across the country. And obviously there's a demographic challenge, because even when the economy has managed to pull out of recession, it's still being far outstripped by population growth. There are some positives, no doubt about that. I think the launch of the Naira and some elements of monetary policy or declaratory policies are positive. However, this challenge is real, and there is a very strong impetus to rethink the role of government in many critical industries in such a way that we can begin to resolve the fiscal crisis in particular.
What's the thinking and the conversation out there in the developed capitals, financial capitals, economic capitals of the world about where Nigeria needs to be and how does the country get there, investment inflows and all of that? What are you hearing on the ground from those who are fund managers, investment deep pocket folks, whether they are venture capitalists or PEs, as the case may be?
So first of all, if in epistemology, if you're looking at academic cycles and other cycles, a lot of people are rooting for Nigeria to succeed. The reason is obvious. Nigeria is easily the most populous country in Africa. Nigeria is a very strong representative of the Black race, if you have any such definition. And Nigeria's success would have a big knock-on effect on the region. It's a pivotal state and the core of West Africa, without a shadow of a doubt, the economy. There are concerns about the issues I raised in terms of the fiscal challenges the country is facing and the level of borrowing. But there's also a recognition of the potential of Nigeria in terms of the internal market, in terms of the people themselves and entrepreneurship. And there are different positions. The people who have fixed income interest, who are searching for yield, a lot of them are still somewhat comfortable with what they see. But longer term players, like the FDI providers, have concerns about where the country is. But there is some optimism about the future and 2023 ushering some more positive change.
So the big story ahead of everyone now, as we go towards the weekend, is the net zero emission, which is coming very strongly as COP26 summit begins in Glasgow. What should be Africa's position and line of action on the energy transition discourse?
So good question, Bosun. I think the idea of net zero 2050. First of all, let me start by saying it's a good idea. Climate change is real. If you have any doubt, look at Lake Chad up north in Nigeria and compare it to, in my lifetime, it's moved from, it's shrunk by almost 2/3 of its size and even much more in terms of depth. So it's real. The question is something I'd like to characterize as a fight, if you like, between decarbonization and the idea of energy security in the context of justice. So very often the advanced economies, there's a lot of pressure they're putting now on Nigeria and other African countries to decarbonize, and I'm talking about, net zero by 2050. What they're silent about and what they try to do is to decontextualize this and not point out that not only is Africa by far the smallest current emitter of greenhouse gases, but if you look at cumulative greenhouse gases that the advanced countries used, the emitter when they were developing, Africa is a very tiny, almost insignificant fraction of that. Now, it's almost like asking people to say, hey, I've gone to the top of the mountain, but you wait down at the bottom of the mountain, I'll come and take care of you. So Africa faces energy security issues. Africa needs a lot of energy per capita going forward. And if the advanced countries are going to bring Africa on board, then they have to foot the bill of Africa decarbonizing. So even as we speak, Bosun, we're getting Tokumbo cars coming across Africa that are, with dangerous emissions. And even the fuel we import, especially in Nigeria, has unacceptable sulfur levels that would not be allowed in most advanced countries. So in a way, the West is still contributing to Africa's greenhouse gas emission. So they should underwrite the cost of doing it. There was a 100 billion green fund in 2015 that was to have been fully disbursed by 2020. Pre-COVID, only 10% have been disbursed. I feel Africa should be pushing for $1 trillion and have a very finite time frame and a lot of flexibility for interventions that would genuinely bring down carbon emissions and at the same time provide energy security for all Africans.
Just for about a minute, talk to me about competitiveness. By the way, do you think Africa stands any chance as far as competitiveness is concerned?
Oh, absolutely. Bosun, a topic that is hardly ever broached. whenever people talk about where African economies are going, and we hold up economies like Japan, the Asian tigers like Korea, we even look at industrial behemoths like Germany, they fail to put it in full context. Germany, Japan, Korea would not have been where they are today, and Taiwan, if it wasn't for massive American investments, the Marshall Plan post World War II, American investment post the Korean War. If Africa were to have a fraction of that sort of intense capital infusion, it would dramatically change the outcome. There is the binding constraints we try to point to, things like corruption and the rest of them. They matter, but they're not binding constraints. Places like Korea, Indonesia, they moved ahead even with those challenges. So Africa still has young people, cheap labor, great natural resources, and strategic flexibility that can help it enhance its productivity to levels where the cost is below producing anywhere in Asia, Europe, or North America.
Well, thank you so much for your time on the show tonight. Professor Chika Mordi of the Johns Hopkins University and the chairman of United Capital. We look forward to having you on the show next time.